my goal today with you is to obviously share some of those key insights we've had in terms of working with different organisations, just to ensure that we provide some really real-life practical examples. Over the next 20 minutes or so, I want to not only provide you as leaders with some key insights, but equally so, I'd like to actually provide you with some insights in terms of how you can lead your teams through what is obviously an ongoing changing environment. To get started, I do want to emphasise to you that don't feel you have to sit there and kind of capture all of these notes, because post this session, we will email out some of the referenced resources that I'll refer to, and obviously you'll be able to access those. So don't sit back and enjoy it, and obviously we'll work through that information. If you do have questions that you do want to ask, the Q&A, as Angela highlighted, or simply jump into that chat to share some of your thoughts as we work through the content. I do like starting with this quote, life isn't about waiting for the storm to pass, it's learning how to dance in the rain, and I think it's never more relevant than what it is today. What we've observed over the last wee while is people have kind of been getting through COVID on willpower alone. And over a period of time, when the focus was to go back and eliminate COVID, essentially the goal being go back to normality, that has changed somewhat. And we've certainly noticed, even in the last couple of weeks, that resilience that employees have has kind of been dented somewhat at the thought of being in this ever-changing environment. So it's important that we do learn how to dance in the rain, and part of the sessions in terms of what we go through will show you potentially some of the best ways in which you can actually do that. As a leader, we have a huge responsibility in terms of helping our people move through what is a changing environment. The reality, however, is that most people do tend to resist change, particularly when it's imposed upon them, particularly when they don't have any control. People will tend to resist that change. And part of the session is trying to give you that insight in terms of, should you encounter that, what is some of the ways in which you can help facilitate that change process and move people through that change more effectively, not only to benefit you, but also obviously to benefit your business as well. One of the key considerations in terms of is understanding, our change management curve. Now, if you looked up change management 101 on Google at any stage, you would actually see this curve. And this curve is very much highlighting the fact that we do tend to go through a similar process, whereby when we hear about any form of change, we're either excited and enthusiastic about that change, or more commonly, however, perhaps we're a little bit angry or we're shocked about that. Then we move into this searching phase, and that is often represented by that uncertainty, that doubt, that disillusionment, that lack of confidence. And then obviously as we set about new ways of working, then the goal is obviously to come out of that. Now, any effective change management process is, how do we minimize the time spent in that searching phase? How do we minimize the time spent where obviously our employees are somewhat challenged, or even ourselves? So the focus of the session today is minimizing that time spent, particularly in that disillusionment phase. A key factor to consider is the timing of the messaging that is going out to our people. So for example, we've got our ending searching charging phase. So our ending in the searching is that lull that I referred to. Now, if our executive team, and depending on how big our organisations are, obviously get informed or understand the changes that need to be made, as an executive team or a leadership team, we go through that ending, searching and charging phase. Our management team might find out about that, and then ultimately our employees will learn about that. Now, the reason why I want to highlight this initially is that I have encountered a number of leaders that will work through that ending, searching and then charging phase, and often their people are just finding out about those changes that are about to occur. And often there's this gap between the ending, searching and charging phase where we have our leaders becoming quite frustrated with their employees about just not getting on board. Why don't they just get on board? But we've had the luxury of obviously understanding and working through those phases before a number of our team will find out. So just be aware the timing of the message, and be aware that that's a common journey that people will go on. And obviously it takes different amounts of time for each person. The other thing I want to do is, and I'm trying to be as practical as I can, so I've tried to, in this session, not only provide you with some big picture insights, but some little practical tips along the way. One thing that we know that over a long period of time, we're all vulnerable as leaders to developing these negative habitual thinking patterns around particularly change. Now, we know that we all have habits of thought. In fact, we have between 20,000 and 70,000 thoughts per day. We are constantly thinking. We're constantly evaluating our situation. You're judging me right now. You're thinking about what I'm saying. You're probably asking the question, is this a good use of your time? Ultimately, you are judging the things that I talk about. Now, obviously, we can't get to the end of the day and write down our 20,000 thoughts. The way in which we process all of that information is that a lot of our thinking drops to that subconscious level where we don't need to pay attention to it. Now, that doesn't mean, however, that it doesn't have an impact on our emotions and our thoughts and how we feel. And that can leave us feeling in a stronger position, or it can exacerbate those stress indicators. So a flag for us as leaders is to ask the question, what are your habitual thinking patterns around change? And is that working for you, or is that working against you? And that also has ramifications for our team members as well. In fact, one of the things that we're actually observing is the sense of imposter syndrome increasing currently within our workplaces. Why is that the case? Well, often we're able to address our own habits of thought when we go and talk to someone. They provide the evidence that contradicts essentially perhaps some of that negative thinking. When people are in isolation or they're working remotely and they don't have that team surrounding them, often that self-doubt creeps in. And they're vulnerable to developing these ongoing negative habits of thought that put them in a place where those stress indicators are exacerbated. That means they're more likely to resist some of that change. Now, how do we address that? Particularly from a leadership perspective? Well, first and foremost, for you as an individual, I'd recommend the strategy. This will be one of the worksheets that we do send out to you, is that whenever we're experiencing some of those challenges, some of those stresses, ultimately follow this process. It's a great way to change your focus. So what could be your habit of thought around change? It might be a hate change. I just want things to stay the same. It isn't going to work. As an example of potentially some common habits of thought, what is the emotion we experience? Now, what is the goal? Unfortunately, just thinking more positively is not the answer. Unfortunately, that's not a way to often facilitate those habits of thought. The way to do it is to come up with as much evidence that contradicts that existing habit of thought. Until we do that, it's very, very hard to break down those habits of thought that perhaps we've developed over a long period of time. And many of us find ourselves in that position now, whereby we develop those thoughts of, why won't this end? There's no way out. I'm stuck. And we've seen that over and over. And obviously the goal being to obviously minimize those stress indicators. Now, to give you a really practical example, and I like to kind of use real life examples. This is an example that I used with my daughter, my 16-year-old daughter. I apply some of these learnings not only with my team, but equally so in terms of my family situation. I know many of you may have kids out there at the moment that are going through NCEA. This was one of the examples that I thought I'd share with you, whereby my daughter one evening was pretty anxious about an exam that she had the next day. In fact, she became quite teary, quite emotional about it. So what I asked her to do to try and change her focus, to try and change the way she felt, is to write down all of the evidence that strengthened the argument that she was prepared for those exams and essentially that she was going to do okay. Now, by getting her to write them down, it was able to change her focus, which changed the way in which she felt. So we know what you focus on is what you feel. As leaders, sometimes we need to spend some time actually just writing down the things that we want to focus on to put ourselves in a better mindset in order to cope with what is a pretty challenging environment we find ourselves operating within. How do we actually use that with our team? Well, ultimately, you can influence the way in which people feel through the type of questions that you ask. And a good way to do that is if we had an open-ended question around, well, how are people coping, or what do you think COVID means for our organisation? Chances are you're going to get a lot of negativity coming through. It can derail conversations. It can often mean that we don't get the most out of the meetings in which we have. But if we focus those questions and say, what are some of the opportunities that have presented themselves as an organisation, and get our employees focused on that, we come up with a nice big long list and then focus on some of those challenges, we're more likely to change the way in which our teams operate. It's a great way to start a meeting, but again, the nature of the questions you ask can actually influence the way in which people feel. So just a quick little strategy you may actually have a practice of, even with your daughter. It's a good way to practice. Ultimately, also, in our first session, the first round of sessions we talked a lot about values. And as a continuation on from that, I do want to talk a little bit about personal values, because again, it has a huge implication around our ability to cope with change. And in my experience, and in working with a whole range of different teams and different organisations, we know that ultimately people's personal values have a huge influence on how they feel, their willingness to cope with change, and certainly their degree of resilience to cope with that changing environment. So just quickly to get people up to speed, we know that our values come from our life experiences. When we're promoting those values, we're more likely to be resilient, engaged, and motivated. When those values are being compromised in some way, we're more likely to suffer those stress indicators. We're more likely to show resistance, and often it makes it harder to move through a change process. The challenge we have is not a lot of people can have that clarity, or don't have that clarity about what their unique personal values are, which we'll talk about more in a moment. When we don't have that clarity around what those values are, we're all vulnerable, all our team members are vulnerable to being like onions. That is an onion on screen. I'll explain the concept in behind it. We know that when those values are being compromised in some way, people tend to present or build these layers over top of that. They start experiencing some of these stress indicators. They start identifying why they're feeling stressed. And often they present these surface related issues. And in a good example, I recently worked with a team where the overriding challenge that was being presented was workload issues. And often we'll have, as a team, we're trying to address those workload issues, but in actual fact, when we drill down to the core, when we drill down to what values are being compromised, it actually had nothing to do with workload. And that often presents challenges for leaders. Why? Because they end up trying to address the things that are being vocalized, not the things that are influencing how people feel. And we're going to give you a practical example in terms of how you can actually address that. We know we have our own bucket. When we're topping that bucket up with things that promote our values, we feel good. Life being life, however, we experience events that compromise our values. Now, we want to ensure there's more going in than there is coming out. Otherwise, we are vulnerable in terms of, again, those stress indicators, or resisting any change in which we actually encounter within our workplace settings. And we can simply look across, just as an example, our different people on screen. We've got our balance team, achievement and status employee, based upon what their values are. Now, when we talk about employees and obviously being engaged and resilient and tapping into that discretionary effort, the likelihood is they're operating within an environment that promotes the things that are uniquely important to them. When we can create that, they are more likely to be engaged and so on, or cope with any of those changes in which we actually encounter. This has probably had the single biggest influence on how our people are feeling today. Why? Because our environment is constantly changing. When we don't have clarity about what's uniquely important, it's very hard to implement strategies that are going to be effective. Now, this is probably the single most important slide in this whole deck. So definitely zone in on this one. Put your coffee down, focus on this one for a moment. Change requires us to find new ways to achieve personal value fulfillment. As our environment changes and the requirements on us change over time, that can influence our ability to top our bucket up. We're required to often find new ways to promote the things that are uniquely important to us, not only as leaders, but for our people as well. And again, I'm going to give you some tangible examples of that. Now, as we can see on our table here, let's assume we've got someone who values recognition within our team. In a pre-COVID environment, they may have been surrounded by a fantastic leader like yourselves who are providing ongoing feedback, they're getting ongoing recognition. Now they find themselves working remotely at home, whereby they're not getting the same opportunities for that positive feedback. They're wondering why they're disengaging from their role. So ultimately, we'd want to look at, well, what are the strategies that employees can implement to promote that value of recognition based upon that new environment. Our next one, control. We've got someone who pre-COVID has a consistent work environment. They've got processes in place. They've become, accustomed to their environment. They've got control over what happens across the course of their day. And then, of course, we're in an environment where we could go in lockdown tonight, where things can change dramatically very, very quickly. That has far-reaching implications for the way in which they operate. Getting those individuals to focus on the things that they have control over is a fantastic strategy. So writing a big long list of all the things they're worrying about, across all the things they don't have control over, is a way to promote control in an uncontrollable environment, and so on. And you can see those final two examples as well. But what I want to draw your attention to is our previous environment that has changed. We are now in this new COVID environment. And with clarity about what's uniquely important to us, we can put the strategies in place that we have control over to top our buckets up, to cope with what is a demanding environment. And it's important that we get clarity around what those values are. Now, when we actually look at our quadrant here, we can see that we've got our employee value fulfillment increasing on the left, the needs of our business on the right. In terms of going horizontally, people tend to fall in one of four quadrants. The first one, lose-lose scenario. If they're not getting a high degree of personal value fulfillment or not meeting the needs of the organisation, obviously that's a lose-lose scenario. Chances are they're not going to stay. Chances are they're going to move on. If they're getting a high degree of personal value fulfillment, and that could be someone who's loving working from home, they don't want to go back into the workplace, but they're required to go back into the workplace, that has implications from an organisational perspective. The goal is to potentially train them in different ways or look at ways in which they're operating to move them to the right-hand side. Unfortunately, we find a lot of people operating in this bottom right quadrant. And that is often where they're meeting the needs of the organisation, but they don't have clarity about what their personal values are, or worse still, they expect the organisation to promote the things that are uniquely important to them. And we often see that where they're not taking ownership or responsibility to build the strategy to cope with the changes in which they're encountering. And the goal obviously being getting everybody in that top right-hand quadrant. That's a win-win scenario. Now, what's making this relationship a little bit more complex is the needs for our business constantly are changing. So those needs are constantly changing, but we need to ensure that we're giving our people the opportunity to understand what's uniquely important to them, to give ourselves the best opportunity to be top right. We often as leaders tend to be very good at that bottom right, that bottom continuum, that business value fulfillment, but less focused on that top left. The next session in which we're going to be running for your employees is getting them to understand this relationship and reinforcing the importance that they take personal responsibility through this change process and not relying on the organisation alone to promote what's uniquely important to them. Now, what is also very important to understand as leaders is what drives us, what drives our behaviour doesn't necessarily drive our employees' behaviour. And in fact, whenever we judge other people on what our personal values are, there is that potential for conflict. And we are seeing a lot of conflict developing in various organisations, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So ultimately, how do you identify values in others? Well, there's a couple of strategies in which you can do that. Starting with probably one of the easiest ways is listen to what they say. You can ask values-based questions, but when you listen to someone speak, and it's important you let them speak, ask yourself what values are underpinning that behaviour. As soon as you start listening to someone from a values perspective, often that can give you quite unique insights, and we've got a series of values-based questions that you can also ask. The next strategy is we've got a tool that we're going to send out to you, and based upon the observations around some of the behaviours you may have already observed, It's a great way to kind of work your way through a bit of a practical exercise to identify what potentially that person values and what they fear. By promoting what they value gives you an opportunity to help them top up their bucket. Right through to obviously a value sheet that we can also share with you, whereby you might want to go through a more formalized, structured process to help the individual identify what it is that they value so they can take ownership in terms of getting that top right-hand quadrant in terms of which we just went through. But we will send these out to you to give you obviously some really practical, useful tools. Now to summarize, and I guess to kind of wrap this up before we get into some further chat, just some quick tips, from leading change. Give people the benefit of the doubt and expect that some people will resist change. That is part of our normal change curve. It's not a fundamental flaw in our employees. Depending on what they value, it's going to influence people in different ways. Obviously, people go through that change process. Sometimes we need to give people time to re-establish essentially what that value fulfillment behaviour looks like. Look below the surface when resistance is being displayed. Think about our behavioural iceberg. What are the values that are influencing that behaviour? Reinforce what's not changing. Unfortunately, a lot of leaders tend to focus on what is changing because they want to communicate those messages, but equally so, reinforce what's not changing. Why? Because people can anchor that value fulfillment on the things that are staying the same. So reinforce that as much as you possibly can. Make time for questions. Why? Because it gives people the chance to re-establish ways in which to promote the things that are uniquely important to them. Bring people together and plan and execute. Obviously, only when that's actually possible. I know that's not always possible, but the sooner you can get your people involved in some of those decisions, the more likely they are to create that environment that promotes the things that are uniquely important to them. Be positive during that change. Reaffirm the purpose of why. You as a leader might be reaffirming what you've got control over, what you haven't got control over, but it's important as leaders we guide our people through that process and not get stuck in just the what. It's being aspirational and reinforcing the goals from an organisational perspective of what we're trying to achieve. Reinforce the importance of not trying to control the uncontrollable. And as I mentioned, you might actually start off a meeting just by simply identifying that with your people. These are the things we can't control. These are the things that we can control. Let's focus on these for our meeting in order to achieve the outcomes in which we want to achieve. Often that is a good way to get better use out of those conversations, those discussions. Identify and ensure the cultural icons are on board. Now, ultimately, if you've got a larger team and you're thinking, gosh, Brad, how am I going to help people, fulfill the things that are important to them? What I'd encourage you to do is actually focus on your cultural icons within your organisations. Not necessarily the ones that have the formal power, but the ones that have the informal power, the ones that are likely to influence the perception of others. If you're limited on time, focus on those people because you'll get much better bang for buck for the time in which you're actually investing. So get those cultural icons on board as much as possible. And then finally, be an example. I often also encourage that as a leader, it's important that we should never complain downwards, we should only complain upwards. And it's important that even from your own personal value perspective, is that you don't be negative with your team to feel like you're building that value of teamwork. As a leader, it's important we separate that out and understand what our role is, and that is inspiring and driving some of those changes that can be quite challenging, particularly in this environment.